I want you to pull up in your mind's eye your neighborhood. Not just the buildings, the streets, the trees, but also the people. What do they look like? What race are they? Have you ever wondered why your neighborhood looks the way it does? Have you ever asked yourself why some neighborhoods are ravaged by drugs and violence and others are not? Have you ever wondered why neighborhoods that once had open-air drug markets now have upscale restaurants and farmers markets? I have, because each time I visit the neighborhood where I was raised, it has more and more upscale restaurants and fewer Black people. I grew up in a primarily Black middle-class neighborhood in Washington, D.C. called Petworth. Last time I was there, I ate in a restaurant whose specialty was raw hamachi with pomegranate sauce, preserved lemon, and satar. This was a far cry from the fried chicken wings with mumbo sauce my best friend Maralaka and I used to get from the Chinese carryout. When I was growing up in Petworth, there was no rustic pizzeria, no wine bar, no cider tasting room. And apart from my family, there were few white people. All this has changed. Petworth is gentrifying, which is when the gentry, middle-class people, move into a neighborhood that has low levels of public and private investment. Petworth has gentrified only because it first experienced disinvestment, which refers to the fact that Petworth lost public and private investment. You see, real estate developers built Petworth as an all-white neighborhood in the early 20th century. By the time my family moved to Petworth in 1976, nearly all the white people had left. Petworth was still middle class, but now it was primarily Black and experiencing disinvestment. When I enrolled in kindergarten in our neighborhood school in 1978, I was one of 2 white children at that school. The other white child, my brother Ian. When I was in 2nd grade, I transferred to a new school where there were only a handful of students who were not white. My new school had carpeting, a library full of books, and a beautiful playground. My old school had linoleum floors, a sparse library, and we spent recess walking single file around the block with our teacher. I spent the rest of my childhood taking the bus from my primarily Black neighborhood east of Rock Creek Park to primarily white schools west of the park. I'd get on the bus across the street from the corner store owned by Mr. Coe, where I used to buy Big Mama sausages. We'd ride past the liquor store, where Monique and I used to buy cigarettes for her grandmother and later for ourselves. Then we'd ride past the funeral home, where I attended Erica's funeral after she was gunned down in a drive-by shooting. On the other side of the park, there'd be houses on tree-lined streets and the occasional white person jogging. The bus didn't turn onto Connecticut Avenue, but if it did, it would have passed by the Politics and Prose bookstore, the Bread and Chocolate Bakery, and the Parthenon Greek restaurant. One of my earliest memories is of going to a May Day march with my father and chanting, "Asian, Latin, Black, and white workers of the world unite," with activist parents. I grew up well aware of the harms caused by racism and capitalism. And you probably won't find it surprising to learn that I'm the founder of the Racism, Capitalism, and the Law Lab and a professor of sociology at the University of California, Merced, where I teach classes on race and racism. Despite my extensive anti-racist education, I didn't learn how racist policies had affected the neighborhood where I grew up until I came across the work of the historians at Prologue, DC. I learned that racial segregation in Petworth began with the use of racial deed covenants. These covenants are lines in deeds that read, "This home shall not be sold or rented to a Negro." The real estate industry and white homeowners used these covenants to prevent African Americans from moving into Petworth until 1948, when the Supreme Court ruled those covenants were not legally enforceable. With this court decision, Black people could move into Petworth. One of the first Black people to move into Petworth was a doctor by the name of Clarence D. Hinton. Dr. Hinton knew his white neighbors might try to prevent him from moving into this all-white neighborhood, so he found a white person to negotiate the sale on his behalf. Once the neighbors realized a Black family was moving in, they put padlocks on the doors to try to prevent the Hintons from moving in. This did not stop Dr. Hinton from moving his family into his new home. Within a generation, nearly all their white neighbors would leave. When a Black family moved into an all-white neighborhood, realtors perceived an opportunity for profit. Realtors used scare tactics to frighten white families to sell their homes and get out before the neighborhood turned. Realtors would then buy the homes and sell them to Black people for a handsome profit. This practice is called block busting. It happened across the city and created white flight. Between 1950 and 1970, half the white residents of DC left the city. As Black families were moving to Petworth, white families fled to the suburbs. The real estate industry and the federal government worked together to keep the suburbs white. The Federal Housing Administration advised banks not to grant loans in areas where African Americans lived, as these were not good investments. This practice is called redlining because areas where Black people live were shaded red on color-coded maps. Racial segregation was not an accident. It was a direct result of racially restrictive covenants, block busting, redlining, and white flight. The FHA's notion that investing in Black communities was a poor investment choice became a self-fulfilling prophecy. As the government divested from the city, so did the private sector. As white families moved to the suburbs, so did the jobs. By 1990, 2/3 of the jobs in the DC metropolitan area were in the suburbs. Half of all Black youth were unemployed. Enter crack cocaine. With high unemployment and failing schools, young men began to sell crack in open-air drug markets to make ends meet. Crack was lucrative. Turf wars and gun violence ensued. In 1991, Washington, D.C. had the highest homicide rate in the country. The city's response to this tragedy was to double the police force. By the end of the 20th century, Washington, D.C. had the highest incarceration rate in the world. The capital of the nation became a world leader in incarceration. This devastation touched the lives of my closest girlfriends, Monique, Maralaka, and Tracy. As children, Monique, her dog Brutus, and I spent our summers splashing in Rock Creek's cool waters. Monique's first love was Maurice, who lost his life to a gunshot wound. Every weekend in high school, I'd walk the 2 blocks from my house to Maralaka's home to get dressed, to go out to the Ibex, the Metro Club, or the Black Hole to hear one of DC's famed go-go bands. Her baby brother, Alo, always had something to say about our outfits, which were invariably short, tight, and colorful. It was the 80s, after all. I didn't mind Alo's teasing, as he always teased us, as he did everything with a big old smile. Every memory I have of Alo is of him smiling. In my first year of graduate school, Alo was brutally murdered. Tracy was so proud of me when I went off to college. 2 years after I moved into the dorms, her brother Mark, who was the smartest and coolest dude I knew, was off to prison where he faced a life sentence. Monique sold her grandmother's home after she passed. Maralaka's family lost their 6-bedroom home to foreclosure. When Tracy's brother Mark was arrested, the federal government used asset forfeiture laws to seize the home Tracy's grandfather had purchased in the 1950s. The dispossession of Black middle-class residents made gentrification possible. It became profitable for investors to purchase devalued houses, foreclosed homes, and forfeited properties to create new homes for new people. Disinvestment, combined with low housing prices, record low interest rates, and tax incentives, made Petworth attractive to investors after decades of abandonment. Disinvestment made reinvestment profitable. In 2016, a real estate company ranked Petworth first in the nation for the profits investors could make from flipping a home, with an average profit of over $300,000 per sale. Reinvestment does not erase the violence of disinvestment. Are you ready for the 6-point policy plan that will? Unfortunately, there is no 6-point policy plan. There are no policies that can return the 4,000 lives lost to homicide in Washington, D.C. There are no policies that will return the human potential stolen from our neighborhood when the brightest minds were given life sentences for drug offenses. Today, most people I grew up with cannot afford to live in Petworth. They attended disinvested schools, which made graduating from high school difficult and finishing college even more challenging. The loss of their loved ones to homicide and the prison system made thriving in young adulthood difficult. There are exceptions, of course. Madalaka's youngest sister, Ezewine, is a doctor. She was able to turn the tragic loss of her brother into the motivation she needed to finish her medical degree. It took an unfathomable amount of strength for Ezewine to earn enough to be able to afford a home in Petworth. When I was growing up, nearly all the residents of Petworth were Black. Today, less than half are. When white people move in and Black people move out, housing prices go up. You know, there's one reason home values increase when white people move in: racism. There's one reason homes are assigned value at all: capitalism. Replacing carryouts with upscale restaurants does nothing to dismantle racism or capitalism. Dismantling racism and capitalism requires us to ask a new and different set of questions. Questions like, what if we invested in people instead of prisons? What if housing were a human right instead of a commodity? What if profits were no longer the driving force of our society? I invite you to join me and abolitionists like Angela Davis, Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, and Mariame Kaba in imagining and building a movement for a world where young women like Ezewine can flourish without needing deep wells of resilience, where the potential of young Black men like Mark is not squandered, where lives like Alo's and Maurice's do not end in violence, a world where Black lives matter. Thank you.